uncomfortable.
Well Done, The Naughtiest Girl by Enid Blyton, read by Sarah Moore. Chapter 1. A nasty surprise for Elizabeth.
The Leavers concert is going to be something very special this year, Elizabeth, said the music master. Very special indeed.
Mr. Lewis was in charge of music at Whiteleaf School and also taught piano, violin and flute. Elizabeth took piano lessons with him, but had been excused them for the past few weeks, as she had been very busy with the summer play. The play had been performed now, so she was free to resume them, but she had almost forgotten her first lesson back. She had had to run all the way to the music room.
Even more special than last year?
Asked the Naughtiest Girl, puffing as she recovered her breath.
I thought it was such a lovely concert last summer. I really enjoyed myself.
She undid the straps of her regulation brown leather music case. Then she scrabbled inside to find her sheet music. Which piece had they been working on? She couldn't recall.
Yes, Elizabeth, I seem to remember you were excellent, replied Mr. Lewis.
The elderly music master fingered his beard and looked thoughtful.
You worked very hard for it.
Elizabeth felt pleased. She was still basking in the warm afterglow of the first form play. Her interest quickened. How exciting it would be to take centre stage again so soon. The school concert, of course. It was held right at the end of the summer term, and parents were invited. Her mother and father would be coming, just as they had last year. Her one tiny regret about the play was that Mummy and Daddy had not been there to see her. How well she remembered last year's concert at the end of her very first term at Whiteleaf School. She had started the term as the naughtiest girl in the school, hating the idea of boarding school and doing everything bad she could think of, with the intention of getting herself sent home. But she had ended the term as a proud member of the school, playing 2 duets on the platform with a brilliant boy called Richard, as well as a little sea piece on her own. She remembered the applause ringing in her ears and the happy looks on her parents' faces.
Why will this year's concert be so special, Mr. Lewis? She asked, as she found a piece of music and sat down at the piano. Because we have some very special leavers this time, he reminded her. Last year, only 2 or 3 boys and girls were old enough to leave Whiteleaf, but this year there's a whole batch. And what a fine batch they have been. Not just Roger, who's won his scholarship, but Charles and Colin and Lynette and, most important of all, our head boy and head girl. They have been the finest heads we have had at Whiteleaf for a long time.
William and Rita, exclaimed Elizabeth. Of course. Oh dear, I just can't imagine Whiteleaf without them. I do wish I could make time stand still.
But then you'd have to stay in the first form forever, Elizabeth, chided Mr. Lewis. And you wouldn't like that, would you?
She shook her head so hard that her brown curls flew back and forth across her face.
No, I would not, she exclaimed.
If there was one thing she was looking forward to with all her heart, it was the prospect of moving up in September. It would be brilliant to go up into the second form with Julian and Kathleen and Belinda and all the other boys and girls in the first form who were old enough and clever enough to do so. How grown up they would feel then. Her friend Julian would have to stop playing so many jokes in class and start behaving like a responsible second former. And it would be lovely to be reunited with her best friend Joan, who was already in the second form and a monitor. It was all going to be such fun. And if losing William and Rita was the price that had to be paid for time not standing still, then Elizabeth had to be willing to accept it.
I expect excellent replacements will be found for William and Rita when the time comes to elect a new head boy and girl, Mr. Lewis was pointing out. But in the meantime, it's been decided to give them a very special send-off, to make the Leavers concert one of the best we've ever had. Something for them to remember forever." "How wonderful!" exclaimed Elizabeth. She suddenly felt very excited. What a privilege it would be to play at William and Rita's Leavers concert. She thought back to the duets she had taken part in last year. To play some beautiful duets with Richard again, to be part of William and Rita's last memories of Whiteleaf. How thrilling that would be! "Richard won't be one of the Leavers, will he?" she asked suddenly. "No, we've got Richard for another year or two yet," replied Mr. Lewis. "I'm pleased to say, but even Richard won't be the star performer this year. You see, to make the concert extra special, Miss Bell and Miss Best have invited Courtney Wood, the well-known concert pianist, to come and play, and he has accepted." The music master could barely conceal his pleasure. "Isn't that exciting news, Elizabeth?" "Oh," said Elizabeth dully. "Won't any of the boys and girls be playing at the concert then?" Of course," replied Mr. Lewis a trifle impatiently. He was glancing at his watch now and turning over the sheet of music that Elizabeth had propped up in front of her. It was time for the lesson to begin. "But we won't be able to have half as many children as usual. Just one musician from each form. That's all we'll be able to fit into the programme. There won't be any duets this year. The very best child from each form will play, that's all. Richard will represent his, of course." Elizabeth's hopes immediately rose again, so she still had a chance of being picked then, and as a solo performer. She thought about it. In the first form, Harry was keen but not very good. His hands were like a bunch of bananas, Richard often said. Arabella had been learning the piano for a long time, but it was well known that she was always in trouble with Mr. Lewis for never doing her piano practice. Belinda and Edward were both learning the violin, but they had only started last term. "Tut, tut!" exclaimed Mr. Lewis, breaking into her calculations. He was removing the sheet of music from the piano. "This won't do, Elizabeth. You've put the music on its stand upside down. And what's this?" He turned the sheet the right way up. "We finished Serenade before half-term. We're on that difficult arrangement of Greensleeves now. Don't you remember?" Flustered, Elizabeth groped in her brown music case and found the correct sheet. It was right at the bottom. "What's it doing buried down there?" scolded Mr. Lewis, as he opened it up at the first page and placed it on the stand for her. "Now, let's see if you've been doing your piano practice." It was soon very obvious that she had not. "Really, Elizabeth," winced the music master, as she got all tangled up on the opening bars. "What's happened to you? You were playing that opening beautifully not long ago. And look at the little finger of your right hand, all scrunched up. You'll never reach the high notes like that. Stretch it out wide. Stretch!" The lesson went badly. "Elizabeth, you are a very naughty girl," Mr. Lewis said to her afterwards. "I don't believe you've done any piano practice at all lately. I don't believe you once went near the piano while you were mixed up in that play of yours. Am I right?" "Yes, you are right," confessed Elizabeth, looking upset. "I'm sorry." The little girl was too proud to make excuses. She was too proud to explain that going to all the rehearsals for the play and learning such a big part until she was word perfect in every line had been a difficult task. There had been other things to worry about too, which had taken up all her spare time and energy. Though they were all now sorted out, they had loomed large at the time. In the meantime, not only Elizabeth's piano practice, but a lot of her schoolwork too, had been pushed to one side. She would not have dreamt of explaining this to anyone for fear of looking feeble. In any case, Mr. Lewis was smiling at her now. He had spoken more in sorrow than in anger. "Cheer up," he said. "I can see you really are sorry, and will turn over a new leaf. If you do your practice every day, you'll soon make up your lost ground. Practice makes perfect. That's what I'm always saying to Arabella," he chuckled. "Yes, that's what I've been telling her for a long, long time." Elizabeth mildly wondered what there was to chuckle about, as far as Arabella was concerned. But she was so relieved that Mr. Lewis was not being cross any more, she cared not. "I will do my practice every day, I promise," she said happily, as she packed her music case and prepared to leave. "When I come for my lesson next week, you'll see such a difference."
"I shall look forward to that, Elizabeth."
She longed to ask more questions about the Leavers' concert. In particular, she longed to hear Mr. Lewis say that she stood a good chance of being picked to represent the first form. But her good sense told her that this was hardly the right moment. She would ask him next week, when she had had a chance to catch up on her piano practice. He would see how well she was progressing with the difficult new piece. Then, surely, she would be chosen to play it at the concert. It would be such an honour to play it for William and Rita and the other Leavers, in front of the whole school, in front of all the parents, in front of her own parents. It was a thrilling thought.
"You're looking cheerful, Elizabeth," said Julian Holland as she came into the common room. "Where have you been?"
The boy with the dark, untidy hair and humorous green eyes pushed his chessboard to one side. He had been working out a few interesting chess moves. But nothing was ever more interesting than talking to the bold, bad Elizabeth. They were great friends. "Piano lesson," she replied. "Here, Julian, have a chocolate biscuit. As a matter of fact, I am feeling cheerful."
"Must have been a good lesson," grinned Julian.
"Not especially," replied Elizabeth airily. She was not going to admit, even to Julian, that she had been unable to cope with her piano practice recently and how disappointed Mr. Lewis had been in her. "It's just that Mr. Lewis had some interesting news." She told him all about Courtney Wood coming to play at the end of term. And then, even though the common room was empty, she dropped her voice low and confided in Julian her secret hopes. "I do believe you're getting quite stage-struck, Elizabeth Allen," teased Julian.
"Not content with being the star of the summer play, you've now decided you'd like to appear on the same platform as Courtney Wood."
There had been a time when the Naughtiest Girl would have flared up at that, but now she just took the joke against herself in good part. "It's not that, and you know it," she smiled. "I'll tell you what it is. It's because of William and Rita. Oh, Julian, I can hardly bear to think that this is their last term at Whiteleaf. I want to practice and practice until I can play my piece really beautifully. It's just the right music somehow, and says everything I'm feeling and how sad I am at saying goodbye. They've given me so much and helped me to be a better person and—" Julian gazed at his friend in admiration. He could see how sincere she was being. She was struggling to find the right words. He finished the sentence for her.
"So this would be your way of saying thank you? Of giving them something back?"
"Yes, that's it exactly," said Elizabeth gratefully.
"Well, I expect you'll be chosen," said Julian airily. "Nobody else in the first form is much good except you, Elizabeth. At least, that's what I've always heard." "Blow it. I think I'd like to give William and Rita something myself.
I think I'll carve them a little wooden animal each, a mother bear and a father bear.
How about that, Elizabeth?"
"Oh, Julian, that's a brilliant idea."
"I must start looking out for just the right bits of wood. I say, we are going to miss them, aren't we, Elizabeth?"
The two friends fell silent for a few moments. Elizabeth swallowed hard. "But it's got to be, hasn't it?" she said at last. "Mr. Lewis reminded me of what would happen if you made time stand still. If William and Rita were just to stay as head boy and head girl forever and ever and never move on."
"What?" asked Julian.
"We'd all have to stay in the first form forever and ever too," said Elizabeth wryly. "We wouldn't be able to go up to the second form in September."
"What a nightmare," said Julian. He laughed. "Oh, we couldn't stand for that. I don't know about you, Elizabeth, but I can't wait."
"Me neither," agreed the Naughtiest Girl. It was such a happy thought that they both felt cheerful again. But Elizabeth's happiness was to be very short-lived. The next morning, Miss Ranger, their form teacher, told the class the result of this month's tests. She read out the new positions in class. Julian had come top as usual. His cousin Patrick had worked hard and come second. Elizabeth, who usually came very high, waited in vain to hear her name read out. She was in for a nasty surprise. She had come third from bottom. Even Arabella, the oldest in the class, but usually near the bottom, was 2 whole places above her. Since half-term, she had been working frantically hard and had made her very best effort. "You will have to do better than this in the end-of-term exams, Elizabeth," said Miss Ranger, "or we may have to keep you in the first form a little longer." Elizabeth could hardly take it in. She had been beaten in class by Arabella. However, the sight of Arabella's gloating face made her determined not to show her true feelings. She spoke airily, almost defiantly. She repeated what Mr. Lewis had said to her the previous day, the first words to come into her head. "I shall soon make up any lost ground, I dare say, Miss Ranger." But inwardly Elizabeth was shaking. She had been given a dreadful fright. Chapter 2. 2 Little Puzzles. After that, Elizabeth decided that she must start revising very hard indeed for the exams. But she didn't want any of her classmates to know what a fright she'd been given, not even Julian. She lost no time in finding herself a secret den, somewhere that she could study in peace. She found the perfect place high up in an oak tree. She was there now. Above her head came little rustling sounds as 2 doves moved along a branch. A pair of collared turtle doves with black half-collars round the back of their pale, dusty brown necks. They were permanent residents of the old oak, along with all manner of other creatures. The doves were getting quite used to Elizabeth's presence. This was the 3rd day running that she'd been here. As she began to recite her French verbs, they began to croon as though to keep her company. Je suis, tu es, co, co, co. Il est, nous sommes, co, co. Elizabeth's little tree house had been a wonderful find. She was delighted with it. "I'm quite near the school buildings," she thought with a smile, "yet nobody knows I'm here. Nobody can see me or hear me up here. It's my own secret place. Nobody can make fun of me now." The way that Arabella had gloated over her plunge down the form order had been almost too much to bear. The 2 girls disliked each other intensely. Elizabeth hated Arabella's pretty little face and perfect manners, her high opinion of herself, and the airs and graces she put on. Arabella despised Elizabeth for her untidiness, her noisy, boisterous ways, and the fact that she seemed to get away with things just because people liked her. It puzzled Arabella why they should. Nor had Elizabeth taken kindly to the teasing from her classmates, even from Julian. The truth was that, unlike Elizabeth, none of them took Miss Ranger's words seriously, about her being kept down in the first form. And Elizabeth had taken such care to hide her true feelings that they had no idea how scared she was feeling. "What would you like for your next birthday, Naughtiest Girl?" Julian had joked. "Remind me to buy you a rattle." Elizabeth had pretended to laugh, but it was soon after that she noticed the oak tree and decided to explore it. From the school grounds, only the upper part of the tree was visible, for it stood on the other side of the school wall, somewhere in the outside world. But its heavy boughs brushed the top of the wall in places, and some of the branches overhung the grounds. Elizabeth had peered up into the dense green foliage. How mysterious and cool and inviting it looked up in that oak tree. Its boughs seemed to reach down like great arms, inviting her to come up into the tree's embrace. With a feeling of excitement, she realised that, if she climbed to the top of the school wall, it would be extremely easy to crawl along the nearest bough and into the heart of the tree. As soon as she did so, she knew that she had found the perfect hideaway. Where the boughs met the trunk in the midst of the tree, it was possible to sit or even lie down in comfort.
Enclosed in a lattice-work of foliage, it was like being in a secret little house, her own tree house. Wonderful. On her first proper visit, she took her maths book and learnt her 11 times table off by heart. The next day, she took her spelling book and carefully copied out several difficult words until she was sure that she knew how to spell them correctly. Today, Julian had asked her to help him look for pieces of wood, as he wanted to start on his bear carvings. But Elizabeth had made an excuse and headed straight for her hideout again, this time bringing her French verb book with her. Vous êtes, she cheated and peeked into the book, ils sont. She put the book back in her pocket. Then, straddling a bough, her back pressed comfortably into the curve of the tree trunk, she closed her eyes and recited the verb to be all the way through, slowly and carefully. Then again, but faster. By the third time, she was able to rattle through it without stopping. There, I know it now, she thought, with deep satisfaction. It was so grand to be able to recite things out loud as many times as she wanted to, with nobody to overhear. It was so peaceful here, with only the natural world for company. "Hello, Robin," she said, as she opened her eyes. The bird had hopped along the bough to within a yard. It was full grown, but had not yet got its red breast, so Elizabeth knew it must be very young. "Aren't you the lucky one, then? You don't have to learn your verbs yet, do you?" The young robin cocked its head to one side and gave her an enquiring look, followed by a friendly chirp. "I love it here," thought Elizabeth. "There's a whole busy life going on in this oak tree, and it's funny. I'm beginning to feel part of it. I'm even beginning to like the big brown moths that live here, and I think the creatures are starting to get used to me." She stared up into some higher branches, where a family of squirrels had their dray. On her first visit, they had chattered shrilly in great alarm and refused to come out. On the second day, they had made their way up and down the tree very secretively by a back route, hoping not to be seen. But today they had twice scampered down the tree quite close to her, taking no notice of her at all. She settled further back and rested for a while, gazing up at the chinks of blue sky through the tree's top canopy. From the road below, to her left, came the drone of an occasional car. The mighty oak stood on a grass verge beside a narrow road that led to the village. And across the school grounds to her right, from the school buildings, came the sound of a piano being played in one of the practice rooms. "Oh, that's a nice piece," thought Elizabeth. "All ripply and sweet, like a journey through the English countryside. That must be Richard playing." Piano practice. She had forgotten to do it today. Elizabeth roused herself and began to edge backwards along the bough, towards the top of the school wall. As she did so, looking down, she spotted a knobbly little chunk of oak that the tree had shed. It was lying in the grass, close to its roots, not far from the road. "That's just the sort of wood Julian likes when he's carving things," she thought. "It's got an interesting shape. I wonder if I dare get it for him." She could see that it was an easy climb down to the ground. The trunk had several low, stubby branches sticking out. They would make perfect footholds and handholds, but of course it was strictly against school rules for children to venture outside the grounds on their own. "Only I'm not really going anywhere, am I?" Elizabeth told herself. "Just straight down the tree to pick up the wood for Julian, then straight back up again." It took Elizabeth less than a minute to climb down the tree and land on the grass verge, on the other side of the school wall. She scooped up the piece of wood triumphantly. She examined it carefully. Yes, it was a really good piece. Julian should be pleased. As she turned back towards the tree, she stared in surprise at its trunk. "How stupid," she thought. On its handsome pale brown and mossy green bark, someone had painted an ugly white cross. At that moment, from beyond the bend in the road, she heard the distant sound of a car approaching. Supposing it was one of her teachers! Help!
Elizabeth shinned back up the oak tree at speed, dived into its leafy branches, bumped along the bough atop the school wall, then down into the grounds of Whiteleaf. Phew, that was risky. She must not do that again. But as she wandered back towards the school buildings, past the end of the cricket pitch, her thoughts returned to the strange marking on the oak tree's trunk. She wondered why it had made her feel uncomfortable. Then she remembered that they had once been told in a history lesson about the time of the Great Plague, how homes were similarly marked with a cross if the disease had struck. Could the oak tree have some sort of disease? She wondered in dismay. Oh, surely not. It looks hale and hearty to me. She wondered if she could ask one of the teachers about it, in a roundabout way perhaps. It would be difficult, though, without giving away where she had seen it. Oh, surely somebody had just been fooling about.
Elizabeth, whoops! Look where you're going!
She had almost crashed into someone. He was a tall boy, carrying a cricket bat. Richard! Oh, I'm sorry. I was in such a dream. She looked at the bat under his arm. Going off to play cricket?
No, just coming back, said the senior boy, smiling at her. I've had an hour's practice in the nets, and that's long enough for me. I must get back to my piano.
Oh, I thought I heard you playing a few minutes ago, said Elizabeth, in surprise. A lovely, ripply piece. Perhaps it was Mr. Lewis, then.
Not him. He's gone to town to buy the piece I should be playing at the Leavers' concert. And it doesn't ripple, Elizabeth, I can assure you.
Elizabeth continued on her way, frowning slightly. Who had been playing that piece so well, then, if it had not been Richard or Mr. Lewis himself? With something new to puzzle about, she forgot all about the white cross on the oak tree. Chapter 3. Elizabeth hears the music again.
What an excellent piece of wood, Elizabeth, exclaimed Julian with pleasure. Why, it's the very thing.
He rolled it between his palms.
A solid little lump of oak. I shall cut it in half and make two. Those knobbly bits at each end already look rather like bears' heads, don't they?
That's just what I thought, Julian, said Elizabeth eagerly. And one end's fatter than the other. That can be Father Bear.
And the other end can be Mother Bear. Excellent. I'm going to enjoy my wood carving. Oak's good to work with, you know.
After a good wash and tidy up, Elizabeth had rushed through some piano practice and then come looking for Julian. She had found him in the common room. He was not bothering to revise for exams. He was reading a book about famous medical discoveries. She had presented him with a piece of wood.
"Wherever did you find it?" he asked now.
"Oh, just lying on the ground," replied Elizabeth truthfully.
"You've been gone for ages," said Julian. "I wondered where you were."
"Well, for one thing, I've been doing my piano practice," smiled Elizabeth.
"Ah, yes." Julian gave a quick nod.
Some of the other boys and girls were coming into the first form common room. Julian quickly stuffed the piece of wood into his trouser pocket. He wanted to be quite sure that his bear carvings were successful before letting anyone know about them. Belinda came and threw herself into a chair. "If I have to revise another single French verb, I shall die," she exclaimed.
"Only 2 weeks to go till the exams now," said Julian cheerfully.
Jenny came and joined them. She was holding a tin.
"Have some of my birthday cake," she said.
She cut them each a fat slice. It was a gooey chocolate cream sponge with thick chocolate icing on the top. "It's delicious, Jenny," exclaimed Elizabeth, as the cake melted in her mouth.
"I was trying to find you after tea, Elizabeth. Where'd you keep disappearing off to?"
"I can't bear to be indoors at this time of year," replied Elizabeth truthfully. "I've been getting lots of fresh air."
"I expect she's been helping John over in the vegetable garden," put in Kathleen. "That's where she usually disappears to."
Elizabeth had no need to reply, for Belinda at once jumped in with a teasing remark.
"I'm sure I'd be revising for exams if I'd come third from bottom. But then again, I'm not Elizabeth. I'm not the naughtiest girl."
"Blow the silly old exams," said Elizabeth, keeping up her brave front. But it was very satisfying in the maths lesson next day. Miss Ranger gave them some mental arithmetic problems. Twice, Elizabeth was the first to call out the correct answers. 11 boys have to share out 88 sweets equally. What does each of them get? 8, Miss Ranger, cried Elizabeth. Tummy ache, cried Julian. Everybody laughed. That will do, Julian. Well done, Elizabeth. And if 12 rabbits have to share out 132 lettuce leaves equally, what do they get? Into a fight, exclaimed Patrick Holland, determined not to be outdone by his smart cousin Julian. The laughter was more subdued this time, as Miss Ranger was beginning to look cross. Please, Miss Ranger, 11 lettuce leaves, said Elizabeth, putting her hand up. Yes, good. Belinda sighed to herself. Elizabeth was so lucky. Without appearing to do any work, she was getting back into top form again. It was all right for some. However, it was Arabella, not Elizabeth, who got the next question right. 12 men walk 12 miles each. How many miles do they walk altogether? 144, exclaimed Arabella eagerly. Very good, Arabella, said Miss Ranger. My, that was quick. Then Patrick, as usual, had to overdo things and show off, spoiling what had been a fun session. Perhaps they didn't walk all together, but in single file, Miss Ranger. In that case, the answer should be none. After that, they were all made to do sums in their books and had to remain silent for the rest of the lesson. However, as she pored over her sums, Elizabeth felt well pleased. The hard swatting sessions in her secret hideout were already bearing fruit. Of course, it was annoying to find out that Arabella was ahead of her. Arabella had revised her 12 times table. Elizabeth resolved to make that her very next task. But not today. It was the day of the weekly meeting, and no pupil at Whiteleaf was allowed to miss them. Not that Elizabeth minded. On the whole, she very much enjoyed meetings.
After tea, the whole school trooped into the big hall, which doubled as a gym.
There were the 12 school monitors up on the platform, with the head boy and girl seated at their own special table. Elizabeth thought how grown-up and dignified William and Rita looked as she took her own place on the first form benches. They had a large book in front of them, known simply as the book, in which anything important that happened at meetings was always written down. Elizabeth had read the book once. It contained many fascinating case histories of pupils who had misbehaved and showed the reasons for it and how their bad behaviour had been cured. She featured in the book herself, from the days when she had been the naughtiest girl in the school. For the remarkable thing about Whiteleaf School was that the children governed themselves in many respects. The meeting was like a school parliament, where problems were discussed and solutions found. But it was also a kind of court, with William and Rita the judges and the monitors their jury. Pupils who behaved badly were forced to face up to their wrongdoing in front of the whole school, and the meeting would work out how best the problem could be dealt with and cured. And cured it invariably was, for no child was ever considered worthless or beyond reform. No one was ever abandoned by Whiteleaf School. The joint heads, Miss Bell and Miss Best, whom the children nicknamed the Beauty and the Beast, attended the meetings. So did Mr. Johns, the senior master. They were there simply as observers and never took part unless, in very difficult cases, their advice was sought. Today's meeting was not an eventful one. All the children who had received money during the week had to give it in. A monitor always brought round the school box. This week it was Joan's turn. As Elizabeth placed some money that her grandmother had sent her into the box, she exchanged smiles with her best friend. She was so proud that Joan, who had not been in the second form very long, was already a monitor. Elizabeth had herself had a stint as a first form monitor. She had enjoyed being a leader. She looked forward to the day when she might be elected as a monitor again,
as William and Rita had once hinted might happen. For the moment, though, she was thinking only of her more modest ambition, to be allowed to go up into the second form.
She would die with shame if she was made to stay down. She would never be able to look Joan in the eye again. Once the money had been collected up, each pupil in the school was issued with 2 shillings for the week's spending money. Share and share alike was the school motto.
Then, one by one, special requests for extra money were considered and judged on their merits. "No, Chloe, we can't give you extra money for your mother's birthday present. You should have saved up for it, out of your weekly allowance, as all the other children do," said Rita.
The junior form pupil looked disappointed and sat down cross-legged on the floor again with the rest of her form.
John, the head of the school garden, was granted some extra money for a trowel, as one had broken. Harriet was given extra stamp money because her large family was in Australia for a year. It was expensive, sending all her little brothers and sisters birthday cards and airmail letters. Colin asked for money for a new tennis racket, as had been granted to Eileen on a previous occasion. "That's a difficult one," said William. "Rita and I will have to confer with the monitors." It took them a while to come to a decision.
William banged his gavel on the table for silence.
"We hope you don't think it's unfair, Colin, because we know you have played tennis for the school a few times, but Eileen is a regular member of the team and truly wore her racket out because she practices so hard every day. She has some years to go here, and I'm sure will be playing for us much more. You will be leaving Whiteleaf in less than 3 weeks, as will we. When we go to our upper schools, there will be a different system. For the first time, you'll be allowed to keep any money your parents send you, Colin. If you need a new racket badly by then, we're sure they will help you out." "Fair enough," agreed Colin. There were no complaints or grumbles this week, and the 2 head pupils began to wind up the meeting. Elizabeth's mind was already moving on to other things. Talk of Colin and William and Rita leaving so soon had given her a fresh jolt. It reminded her that there was very little time left before the Leavers concert. She longed with all her heart to be a part of that concert, to pay her special tribute to William and Rita from the concert platform. The sweet, sad piece she was learning expressed her emotions far better than words. But swatting for exams every day had not left her all the time she needed for her piano, and Mr. Lewis would be expecting to see a big improvement at the next lesson. She had promised him, and besides, her hopes depended on it. "It's too late to go to my secret den and do my timetable today," Elizabeth decided. "I'll do extra piano practice instead. I'll do a whole hour." She collected her music case after the meeting and set off for her usual practice room. But Sophie had got there ahead of her. She was practicing the flute. Elizabeth reflected that Sophie would surely be chosen to represent the junior class at the Leavers concert. She was a remarkable little player. "I think I'll be here till bedtime now, Elizabeth," the younger girl said wryly. "This is a grade 5 piece, and I'm only on grade 4, but Mr. Lewis says he thinks I can master it." "Don't worry, Sophie, I'll go upstairs." There was a piano on the top floor, right at the end of a long corridor. It was rather out of the way. Nobody bothered to use that one much. But when Elizabeth reached the top landing and walked down the corridor, she heard the distant rippling of the piano being played. "It's that lovely piece again," she realised. "The one I heard yesterday. It must be the same person. Now I can find out who it is." The piano was tucked away in an alcove around a corner at the far end of the corridor. Anxious not to disturb the player, who was in the middle of a delicate diminuendo, she tiptoed the last distance. Then she peeped round the corner. She stared in amazement. It was Arabella. The fair-haired girl was seated at the piano, playing with the deepest concentration. Her friend, Rosemary, stood alongside her and was turning over the pages for her. Elizabeth hurriedly drew back. Her heart was pounding. That Arabella should be playing like that. Her mind could hardly take it in. The conceited Arabella was always showing off. If ever she had something to boast about, she liked the whole world to know. Why had she never let anyone know she could play the piano so well? Why was she keeping it secret? Elizabeth stood there quietly, her body pressed to the wall. And very soon there came the answer to her question. Chapter 4. Joan States Her Opinion. The music stopped. Arabella had come to the end of her piece. Then Elizabeth heard Rosemary speak. "It's perfect now, Arabella. It really is. Shall we go down to our dormy now, and I'll test you on your spelling? You know Miss Ranger said everybody has to pass the English exam before they can go into the second form." Out of sight, Elizabeth held her breath in alarm and shrank back harder against the wall. She would creep away quickly. She didn't want the pair to see her. It would look like spying. About to turn and tiptoe back down the corridor, she heard Arabella's voice next. "We're not going anywhere, Rosemary. We're staying right here. You may think the piece is perfect, but I do not. It is improving, though. Oh, yes, it's definitely getting better all the time." She sounded strangely elated, gleeful. Elizabeth's attention was riveted. "But what about the exams?" asked Rosemary timidly. "You know I'll die if we can't go up into the second form together." "One thing at a time, please. Do stop bleating about the exams, Rosemary," said Arabella impatiently. "Do you really think I've been wearing my fingers to the bone for nothing? Just to throw it all away? Elizabeth started practising again. I've heard her. Now the play is over, I expect she's decided to be in the school concert. Well, she's got such a surprise coming." "I bet Mr. Lewis can't get over how much practice you've done," giggled Rosemary. "All the months you've complained to him about it being boring. He must be amazed." "I'm his pet now," said Arabella conceitedly. "Silly old man. He thinks I'm doing all this to please him." Rosemary knew the real reason. "It's going to teach Elizabeth a lesson if you're chosen this year instead of her." She was rather a weak character. She always said what her friend wanted to hear. "Oh, won't that be fun, Arabella?"
"It's about time she was cut down to size," said the other girl fiercely. "After that I won't do a stroke of this boring old stuff again, I can tell you. Now come on, let me play through this again. Then I shall do my scales."
Elizabeth crept away down the corridor. She had heard enough. All kinds of thoughts and emotions were tumbling through her. Envy, that Arabella could play the piano so beautifully when she really tried. She must have a real gift. How could someone so horrid create such a lovely, delicate sound? Realization. Now she knew why Mr. Lewis had chuckled to himself about Arabella. He had been chuckling with pleasure. He would have recognized Arabella's gifts as soon as she arrived at Whiteleaf School. For months he had nagged at her to do her piano practice, to no avail. And suddenly she had turned over a new leaf. She seemed to want to please him after all. How delighted the elderly music master must be at her dramatic improvement. He lived for his pupils and loved to nurture their gifts. Scorn. How could Arabella be so unkind about Mr. Lewis? A silly old man, she had called him. What a horrid thing to say. How mean that she was not really trying to please him. Nor was she working hard for the love of music or for the honour of playing at the Leavers' concert. It was all being done simply to spite Elizabeth. Elizabeth could feel a temper coming on. What a sneaky person Arabella was. While she had been busy with the school play, Arabella had been swatting away to beat her in class and plotting to steal her piano place as well, just to get her own back on Elizabeth for being in the play. It didn't occur to the Naughtiest Girl that Arabella's desire for secrecy was to be expected. She was learning from past mistakes. Encouraged by the feeble Rosemary, She had been cocksure about being chosen for the play. When Elizabeth had been chosen in her place, she had been made to look a fool. She had decided to be much more careful this time. None of this crossed Elizabeth's mind as, feeling surprised and angry, she walked downstairs, her unopened music case bumping by her side. She didn't feel like doing her piano practice now. She didn't feel like doing anything. She would go and find Joan. Joan would understand how she was feeling. She met her best friend coming out of the second form common room with Susan. Gentle Joan could see at once that something was wrong. Making an excuse to Susan, she linked arms with Elizabeth. "Let's go and sit outside," she said. "It's a lovely evening." They sat on the school terrace. Elizabeth blurted out her secret ambition to Joan. Then she told her everything that she had overheard upstairs. "What a trial Arabella is," said Joan sympathetically. "I don't know what to do now," confessed Elizabeth. "The worst thing is, I think she's playing better than I do. I don't know whether I should go on trying." Joan frowned and thought about it.
"I don't think it would be very nice if Arabella was chosen," she ventured.
"I wouldn't feel happy knowing that someone was playing at the Leavers' concert in such a mean spirit. They should want to do it for the honour, and to give the people who are going a happy last memory of Whiteleaf." "That's exactly how I feel," said Elizabeth eagerly. "Do you think I should go on trying, then?" "Of course," smiled Joan, wanting to make her friend happy again. "Arabella may be talented, but so are you, Elizabeth. She has got a head start at the moment because you've been so busy since half-term. Given that you're both talented, it's all about who can get the most practice. You must practice and practice, Elizabeth, every spare minute of the day. You must at least give it your best." "I will," promised Elizabeth, her eyes shining. "I'll practice till my fingers are worn out, Joan. You just see." In stating her opinion, Joan knew nothing of the fright Elizabeth had been given about dropping behind with her schoolwork. She never dreamt that her friend had a secret fear of the coming exams.
As with Julian and all Elizabeth's younger friends, Joan Townsend never imagined that the naughtiest girl could have any serious worries about her studies.
And Elizabeth was certainly not going to tell her. Her pride wouldn't let her. "Oh, Elizabeth, I am looking forward to your being in the second form," were her friend's last words to her that evening. "Yes, it's going to be really good," replied Elizabeth stoutly. That weekend, however, she blanked all thought of schoolwork out of her mind. It was easier that way. She did not once return to her secret hideout in the oak tree. Her next piano lesson was looming, and the weekend was her last chance of making it a different story from the last one. She practiced non-stop on Saturday and again on Sunday, only taking breaks for meals and other essential activities. She went back to basics with Grade 1 piano scales. Then she worked her way up through the grades, playing the more difficult scales and finger exercises over and over again. Only then would she tackle her latest piece, the difficult arrangement of Greensleeves. She knew that she must achieve technical mastery before she could make it truly expressive. Julian did not mind at that stage. He was pleased to see that the bold, bad girl had got the bit between her teeth. He was very busy with hobbies himself, and also spent a lot of time in the craft room on his wood carvings. Nor did Kathleen or Jenny or Belinda mind. They were busy too, revising for the exams, and only felt envious that Elizabeth could afford to be so casual about them. The only person who minded was Arabella. She quickly noticed what a huge effort Elizabeth was making. Arabella had planned to revise for exams this weekend. She was going to try to learn her French verbs and read her English set book. There would be questions about the book in the English exam. But as soon as she realised what Elizabeth was up to, she abandoned her studies and returned to the piano herself. She must have found out. Have you said something to her, Rosemary?" asked Arabella, pouting sulkily. "Have you?" "No, of course I haven't," said Rosemary indignantly. "People must have noticed you coming up here to practice. You can hear it outside when this window's open. Elizabeth must have noticed. You can't expect to keep it secret forever." The new week dawned. All too soon, in Elizabeth's opinion. It was time for her next piano lesson.
"Hello, Elizabeth,"
said Mr. Lewis, as she appeared in the doorway, music case in hand. He gave her a warm smile. He had noticed how much practice the first former had been putting in.
"Come and sit down. Let's see how we get on this week, shall we?"
The Naughtiest Girl sat down at the piano. Her fingers trembled slightly as she undid the case and found her music. This was a lesson in which she must do her very best. She knew she had made great progress since last week, but would it be enough? She was longing to ask Mr. Lewis about the Leavers concert.
"A marked improvement, Elizabeth," the music master told her when the lesson was over. "I can see you have worked very hard this week to make up for lost time. I'm very pleased with you."
Elizabeth rose from the piano. As she packed her music away, her throat had suddenly gone dry. This, surely, was the right moment to find out what she wanted to know. "Please, Mr. Lewis," she began nervously.
"Yes, Elizabeth?"
"I just wondered if you'd decided yet about the Leavers concert. I mean, who's going to play for the first form? It's not very long now, is it?"
"It certainly isn't,"
he chuckled. He stroked his beard thoughtfully before replying. Elizabeth held her breath. Chapter 5. The Rivals.
"I can quite see that you would like to know, Elizabeth," the music master said kindly. "But the fact is, I seem to have a difficult decision on my hands this year. I expect young Arabella has told you that she would like to be picked for the concert too."
Of course, Arabella had told her no such thing. Fearing that her expression might give her feelings away, Elizabeth just mumbled and stared at the floor. She waited to hear what Mr. Lewis would say next.
"I want to leave it as long as possible before I make up my mind, Elizabeth," he went on. "Apart from anything else, it seems only fair to give you more time to make up lost ground."
Elizabeth's hopes rose, only to be partly dashed again.
"I must warn you, though, that I can't make any promises. Arabella has made remarkable progress lately, quite remarkable. Our lessons together are becoming a real pleasure. One of the great satisfactions of teaching, Elizabeth, is when a pupil at last starts to respond. I must say I am very much looking forward to taking Arabella forward from here."
He quickly cleared his throat, suddenly aware that he had been speaking his innermost thoughts out loud.
"As well as you yourself, Elizabeth, of course, and all the other boys and girls I teach."
In spite of the pain she was suffering herself, Elizabeth's warm heart went out to the music master. Poor Mr. Lewis! After this term, Arabella would lose all interest in the piano as suddenly as she had found it. It would be so sad for him.
"So what I'm proposing to do is to leave it until the last moment," he explained. "I shall have both of you in together, sometime towards the end of next week. By then you will both have had your final piano lessons of the term. You will each play your new piece, and then we will decide. We can't leave it any later than that," he chuckled. "The programmes will need to be run off that weekend, so I will have to make up my mind, won't I?"
Elizabeth nodded eagerly. Her hopes were rising again. Mr. Lewis walked across, opened the door, and showed her out. His next pupil was waiting patiently in the corridor.
"I'll see you for your final lesson next week, then. Keep it up, Elizabeth."
"I shall, Mr. Lewis," she responded firmly. Elizabeth went on her way, her heart pattering. All was not lost. Time was on her side. Arabella had been so cocksure, so certain that she was teacher's pet, and that she had everything in the bag. But it wasn't like that at all. Mr. Lewis was very fair. He obviously thought that they were evenly matched. He said it was going to be a difficult decision. He was leaving the decision as long as he possibly could, until the week before the concert, in fact, until just 1 week before the last day of term. In the meantime, she had been given another week and a half to improve her playing of Greensleeves. In today's lesson, Mr. Lewis had helped her to iron out some problems with the tricky part in the middle. There would be one more lesson next week to sort out any last-minute difficulties. To add the finishing touches. After that, Arabella had better watch out. The following day, Arabella had her own weekly lesson. Mr. Lewis explained the position to her. After the lesson, she came straight into tea. Elizabeth noticed she looked distinctly bad-tempered. This made her feel cheerful. She remembered the fable of the tortoise and the hare. Well, Arabella had hared ahead of her, but now she, the tortoise, had every chance to overtake her. And that she was determined to do. In the days that followed, Arabella's hopes of keeping her ambition a secret were quickly dashed. Some of the first forms soon began to notice that both Arabella and Elizabeth vanished away to play the piano in every spare moment. Patrick heard them on the upstairs landing one evening, fighting over the piano. He spread the news round the common room. "The stupid way girls behave," he said. "I knew I shouldn't have come to a school with girls in it." Privately, he was very put out that he had twice asked Elizabeth to give him a game of tennis. Twice she had made up some feeble excuse. "If you must know," said Rosemary, unable to hold her tongue any longer, "it's all because Elizabeth knows that Arabella's going to be picked for the Leavers concert this year, and she's jealous." "You wish," said Julian sarcastically. Before long, the whole class knew that the two girls were engaged in bitter rivalry for the place on the concert platform. They seemed to have swept all else aside. It was true that the teachers were no longer giving out prep, but they were leaving it to the children's good sense to revise for the summer exams. These always took place in the last week of term, and neither Arabella nor Elizabeth were ever seen doing private study. They just seemed to be in the grips of their piano craze, as Belinda called it. "It's all right for Elizabeth," she said to Jenny one day, "but Arabella's going to come badly unstuck at this rate. You know how hard she has to work just to stand still." "And she's already the oldest in the form, as it is," agreed Jenny. "She should have gone into the second form ages ago. What would happen if she didn't pass her exams? Would they have to keep her down again?" "Miss Ranger says there's no point in anyone going into the second form if they can't do the work when they get there," replied Belinda. "They're both going crazy if you ask me," said Jenny. "Even Elizabeth. I don't think she liked us teasing her about slipping down the form order, but it could be a bit more serious if she doesn't watch out." In Elizabeth's own mind, of course, it was already serious. Over the next 10 days, she woke up each morning fully intending to find time to go to her secret hideout in the oak tree. "I must do some work for the exams today," she would tell herself. But apart from a session on the Sunday afternoon, she never did find time. The end of summer term was always hectic. There was compulsory strawberry picking to do in the gardens. There were the knockout tennis tournaments, with all children expected to play in their different age groups. Of course, Elizabeth loved these activities. She loved it when she got to the semi-final of the first form tournament, but it only left time for her vital piano practice and nothing else. "I'm sorry I haven't been to see you lately," she told the friendly little Robin on the Sunday. "You'll see more of me next weekend when I've got this piano business out of the way. You will see me then, I can tell you." In her heart, Elizabeth knew that by then it might be much too late. The exams began on the Monday. She could no longer bear to think about them. Lately, she had begun to console herself with a new thought. "I can't possibly be made to stay down in the first form like a baby if I'm chosen to play at the Leavers concert. It's going to be such a grown-up occasion this year, with a real concert pianist coming. Even if I don't do very well in the exams, surely Miss Ranger won't mind." So, even on the Sunday, it only needed the distant notes of Arabella's piece starting up to bring Elizabeth scooting down from the oak tree and back indoors to the piano. By the time both girls had taken their last piano lessons of the term with Mr. Lewis, interest in the first form had reached fever pitch.
"How did you get on in your lesson, Elizabeth?" asked Daniel Carter, who had been helping her to practice by turning the pages. Unfortunately, Julian had refused. He claimed not to be able to read music. He felt she was now overdoing things.
"Fine," she replied confidently. "I've sorted out that end bit now."
Martin asked Arabella the same question the next day. He had been taking it in turns with Rosemary to be Arabella's page-turner.
"Mr. Lewis seemed very pleased with me," replied Arabella.
Julian started a sweepstake on the result of the contest, with the children putting in sweets for money.
5 sweets for 4 if Arabella Buckley wins, he announced. 3 sweets for 2 if the Naughtiest Girl does.
Their classmates were all finding it very exciting. But when the summons from Mr. Lewis finally came, the 2 girls themselves were pale with tension. It was after tea on the Wednesday.
"Put your music case on the table there, Elizabeth, next to Arabella's," he said,
as she came into the music room.
"I must decide which order you will play in."
He let both girls run through a few scales to loosen up. Then he looked at his watch.
"Would you like to play in alphabetical order?" he asked with a smile. "You first, Elizabeth."
He meant alphabetically by surname, of course. Allen first, then Buckley. With Mr. Lewis turning the pages for her and Arabella seated quietly near the door, Elizabeth solemnly played her piece. She made no mistakes and put fine expression into it.
"Well done," nodded Mr. Lewis. "Now you, Arabella, please."
Looking neat and tidy as usual, her fair hair brushed and gleaming, Elizabeth's rival took over at the piano. Mr. Lewis straightened her music for her. Now it was the Naughtiest Girl's turn to sit very still and listen. During the past 2 weeks, she had heard snatches of Arabella's piece a great many times. She had heard some of the more difficult passages being played over and over again. She knew it was a lovely melody, but only now, as she heard it through from beginning to end, did she realise just how lovely. It was a pastoral piece, longer and more difficult than Elizabeth's own, and played with deep expression. For a brief time, listening to the music, Elizabeth quite forgot it was Arabella playing, and their intense rivalry. She found herself instead feeling dreamy, with visions of fields and hedgerows and little wooded hills floating through her mind. Even so, it was still a crushing disappointment when the decision came. With a brief "well done" to Arabella, Mr. Lewis walked straight over to Elizabeth and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. In that moment, she knew that she had lost the contest.
"You played beautifully, Elizabeth, but I have made up my mind now. I think we should give Arabella the chance to perform that in public. It distresses me that we cannot have more than one person from each form this year. You deserve to be in the concert after all your hard work. But there it is."
Arabella was still seated at the piano. She seemed transfixed, radiant. She had surpassed herself. Her own performance had surprised even her. Elizabeth at once walked across and shook her hand. "Congratulations," she said. To hide her disappointment, she gave a wobbly little smile. For once Arabella did not gloat. She seemed to be in a happy daze. "Thank you," she said politely.
"Thank you, Elizabeth," echoed Mr. Lewis. "You may leave now if you wish."
As the music master started to discuss with the other girl the arrangements for the concert, Elizabeth turned her face away and hurried to the door. She wanted to flee now. She grabbed the nearer of the 2 brown leather music cases, not realising that it was Arabella's.
Then she scooped up her music, and without even pausing to put it in the case, she shot out into the corridor. She ran all the way upstairs to dormitory 6. Angrily, she hurled both the music and the leather case under her bed. Then she flung herself on top of the bed in despair. Lying there, she could see the pile of schoolbooks on her white-painted chest of drawers, standing there accusingly. It was all her revisions still waiting to be done. She was not going to be in the concert after all, and now she was going to fail her exams. Chapter 6. Julian Learns the Truth.
"Cheer up, Elizabeth. Have some sweets," said Julian as soon as she came downstairs. He produced handfuls of barley sugars and toffees and licorice all sorts from his bulging trouser pockets. "Just look what I made on my sweepstake."
Elizabeth smiled weakly. Everybody had been very kind. Joan had been first into the dormitory to comfort her. "You gave it your very best, Elizabeth. Nobody can do more than that. I'm proud of you. Now all we can do is accept the result." Other girls had come into the dormitory and said lots of nice things. Then her friends had dragged her outside and hustled her downstairs. "Julian's looking for you, Elizabeth."
"He made lots of sweets out of the sweepstake. Now he wants to share them out with everybody."
"Come on, Elizabeth, you mustn't brood. Julian wants you to have first pick." Elizabeth plucked a favourite stripy all-sort from Julian's hand. She popped it into her mouth. Then she chose 2 black ones and put them in her pocket. Everybody cheered. Then, grabbing sweets themselves, they all hurried off to their evening activities, laughing and chatting happily. The contest between Elizabeth and Arabella was over. It had been very exciting while it lasted. Elizabeth and Julian were left alone. From another pocket, he produced 2 extra special, expensive-looking chocolates in crinkly gold foil wrappings. He was determined to cheer Elizabeth up.
"Come on, have one of these. You've worked too hard. You need to get your strength back, Elizabeth."
"Who put these in the kitty?" she asked. She unwrapped the chocolate and popped it in her mouth.
Delicious. Arabella. She backed you to win. A sort of insurance policy, I suppose. She's lost them now."
"Oh, well, that's some consolation," sighed Elizabeth. She looked at her friend in mild curiosity. "However did you end up with so many sweets, Julian? How did you work it all out?"
"Simple," he shrugged. "Nobody much likes Arabella, but everybody likes you. So I made your odds more tempting than hers and guessed everybody would want to back the bold, bad Elizabeth."
"But you didn't think I would actually win?" realised Elizabeth, her face falling. She had never seen Julian blush before.
"I had a little listen a couple of times," he confessed. "It was a great surprise, but I thought Arabella just had the edge on you."
"She did," admitted Elizabeth. "You were right." She looked sad as she spoke. Julian at once tugged her by the hand.
"Come and see what I've got to show you. I've been keeping them a surprise. I want to know what you think. I've been busy too, you know."
He led her along to the craft room. 2 or 3 boys and girls were working on their hobbies, completely engrossed. Otherwise it was empty. Julian led the way to his drawer in the corner. He took something out, wrapped in tissue paper.
"Look," he said, lowering his voice. "Do you like them?"
It was Mother Bear and Father Bear. They were completed. Julian had sawn the piece of weathered oak in 2 and stripped off the remaining bark. From the natural shapes of the 2 pieces, he had wrought a pair of carved animals. Father Bear was thick-bodied and heavy-jowled, with a stern but wise expression. The name William was carved at the base. Mother Bear had a gentle face, full of kindness and understanding. Her name had been carved too, Rita. The wood had been sanded with great care, then polished until it gleamed. The carvings had taken Julian many hours to complete. Elizabeth stared at them in silence. Julian was so clever. They were beautiful. But as she looked at those two names, William and Rita, her own misery resurfaced. It gnawed at her. William and Rita were leaving next week. Julian had used his time wisely. Now he had a beautiful memento to give them. The beautiful memento that she had been planning to give them, her music at the Leavers concert, had come to nothing. She had not used her time wisely. She had used it stupidly. Now she had nothing to give William and Rita. Instead, she might well fail the exams next week and be kept down in the first form like a baby.
"What's the matter?" asked Julian, glancing at her scowling face. He felt very hurt. "Don't you like them? Don't you think they're any good?"
"It's not that, Julian."
"Why are you sulking, then?"
Elizabeth could not bear Julian to think she was sulking or jealous in any way. "The carvings are lovely, Julian. I think you're very clever. It's just that I've been so stupid." Suddenly tears sprang to Elizabeth's eyes, and without warning she found herself blurting out her secret fears to Julian. He looked at her in amazement.
"I'm sure Miss Ranger did not mean it about keeping you down," he exclaimed. "She was just trying to make you work hard and catch up."
"But I haven't worked hard, and I haven't caught up," said Elizabeth in despair. "And now there's no time left, and it's hopeless."
"Of course it's not hopeless, you goose."
He took hold of Elizabeth's arm and led her out of the craft room and into the corridor. He had a feeling that people could hear them in there.
"Look, if you're really taking this work business seriously, you'd better dash off and do some right now. At least that will make you feel better," he added with a grin.
He was humouring her. Privately, he thought her fears were silly. I will!" exclaimed Elizabeth. It had been such a relief to tell someone the truth at last. Julian was so calm about things. She began to feel slightly better. They were quite alone in the corridor now. "I'll go and do my French verbs. I'm going right now. I've got a secret place, you see. Oh, Julian," she begged, "please don't tell anyone about this. Promise."
"I promise. Off you go, then."
Julian watched as Elizabeth hurried off with a little skip. He shook his head and smiled to himself. The Naughtiest Girl was always full of surprises. You never knew what was going on in her head. That was one of the things he liked about her. Whistling softly to himself, he went back into the craft room and replaced the wood carvings in his drawer. He was just leaving the room again when someone spoke. Daniel had caught snatches of what Elizabeth had been saying earlier. Now he raised his head from his clay model and spoke to Julian.
"Poor Elizabeth." Daniel was a sensitive boy. "She's in a terrible stew about the exams, isn't she? I've never seen her in a state about schoolwork before. It's silly of her not to have done any swatting." "Oh, she'll cope all right," said Julian airily. "And don't you go noising this about either. It's Elizabeth's private business and you're a nosy Parker." "Sorry, Julian." Unfortunately, the very next day, Daniel gave Elizabeth's secret clean away. Chapter 7. Elizabeth has a new worry. Daniel did not mean to blurt out Elizabeth's private fears, but next morning, after first lesson, he heard some of the others criticising her. "Have you ever seen the Naughtiest Girl so gloomy in class? She looks like the cat that's had the cream taken away." "It must be because Arabella won. She's in a sulk." "No, she's not," butted in Daniel, unable to stop himself. "She's worried about the exams, that's all. She's fearfully worried." "What, Elizabeth? We don't believe you." "It's true, I tell you." Daniel was determined to defend Elizabeth's good name. "I heard her telling Julian. She doesn't want anybody to know, but she's convinced she's going to fail." This titbit of news passed round the class in the course of the morning. They observed Elizabeth's behaviour with interest. She certainly seemed very absorbed in lessons today, taking copious notes all the time. When Julian made a paper dart and sent it skidding across her desk in the middle of French, she barely noticed. Nor did she raise her head at Mamselle's cry, Zut alors, Julian!
The rumours must be true then. Elizabeth was really worried. She was, but her worries were as nothing compared to Arabella's. After her great triumph of the previous day, she had woken up this morning in a state of panic. When Miss Ranger asked her some simple questions on the English set book, the oldest person in the form got every single question wrong. That was the moment when terror struck at her heart. However, Arabella struggling in class was so commonplace that nobody even noticed. For Elizabeth to be having problems was far more noteworthy. But by tea time, Elizabeth was in a much more positive frame of mind. Last night, in her secret den, she had revised all her French verbs. She had concentrated hard in lessons today and made lots of notes. Straight after tea, she would return to the oak tree for a good long session with her English set book. She could study it there in peace. Miss Ranger had said they must be able to quote from it. She would spend at least an hour there and take extra cheese and biscuits with her, she thought, scooping some up and putting them in her pocket. She hurried up to the dormitory to collect her English book. She noticed the sheet music flapping about under her bed, where she had hurled it the previous evening. There was to be a dormitory inspection tonight. "I'd better put it away," she thought shamefacedly. "I've no time for piano practice any more." As soon as she hauled the music case from under the bed and opened it, she realised that she had picked up Arabella's by mistake. The cases were almost identical, but inside the flap, Arabella had written her name, and there were some chocolate marks as well. When she hid those peppermint chocolates in it, Elizabeth thought disapprovingly. So she must have my case. I'd better go and get it.
Arabella was still at tea. Her dormitory was empty. Elizabeth quickly found her own music case. It was standing tucked between Arabella's chest of drawers and her bed. Elizabeth swapped the two cases over. Arabella's current music was lying loose on top of the chest of drawers. Like Elizabeth, she had not bothered to put it away yet. "So she's not even realised we've got our cases mixed up," thought Elizabeth. "Well, as she's never noticed, I won't bother to say anything." She hurried back to her own dormitory with her proper case. "I'll put Greensleeves away later, when I tidy up my cubicle for the dormy inspection," Elizabeth decided, dumping the case on her bed. "I really must rush now. This is wasting time." Soon she was ensconced in her treehouse once more.
It was all very soothing. The leaves whispered and rustled around her. The big bough was as comfortable as any chair. It had protruding branches on which she could rest her feet as she lay back against the warm, rough bark of the massive tree trunk.
She knew some of the book quite well, and now she must study the remainder. She worked hard for the next hour. She broke off once or twice to feed the robins some biscuit crumbs. She memorised 2 passages from the book that Miss Ranger had told them were important. She smiled as she saw a squirrel scuttle past. "Yes, you've got me back," she told it. She closed her eyes for a few moments. The doves were cooing again. Oh, she did love this special tree. It was so full of life. Perhaps she would share her secret with Joan one day, and Julian. Her eyes opened wide. She could hear the murmur of voices somewhere down below.
Elizabeth peered down through the leaves. There were 2 men standing by the country road. They were looking at the tree and talking about it. Then they came and walked round its trunk immediately beneath her. They spoke again. This time she could hear exactly what they were saying. She frowned, puzzled by their words. They were walking away now in the direction of the village. They glanced back at the tree as they went, still deep in conversation. Elizabeth could no longer hear what they were saying, but she remained deeply puzzled.
What did they mean about a big 'un? And something about some ropes, she wondered. I don't understand.
She remembered the strange white cross that was painted down below and began to feel a sense of foreboding. Elizabeth had a new worry now.
Then suddenly, from the direction of the school grounds, she heard her name being called. It was Julian's voice.
Chapter 8. An exam paper is lost and found.
"Elizabeth, you! Where are you?" called Julian, hands cupped to his mouth. Harry joined in as well. "Elizabeth, come on, wherever you are." "Special meeting," Julian shouted to the empty air. "We've all got to go inside. William and Rita's orders. Special meeting of the first form."
Elizabeth peered through the foliage. She could see the boys over by the school field. Now Harry was grabbing Julian's arm.
"Come on, it's no good, Julian," he was saying. "William and Rita told us to come straight back if we couldn't find her."
The Naughtiest Girl watched the two boys run back to the school building. She felt ill at ease. Drat, she thought. Whatever are William and Rita having a special meeting of the first form for? I don't want to go back inside yet. She wanted to stay where she was for a little while longer. She hated the idea of leaving her tree on its own this evening. Was it something to do with what those men had said? Perhaps. If she stayed for a while, they might come wandering back. They might start talking again. She would listen carefully and try to make sense of what they were saying. But she dare not stay any longer. Not when William and Rita had called a special meeting. Why was it only for the first form? That was very unusual. She'd better hurry. Poor Elizabeth then found herself stuck up the tree in any case for 10 whole minutes. The grounds were very busy at this time of evening. The juniors were coming in from play to have their cocoa. The older pupils were strolling back and forth with cricket bats and tennis rackets. Every time she tried to edge along the bough, to climb down the wall and get back into the grounds, she would hear fresh voices. At last the coast was clear. She raced over to the school, brown curls flying, and made straight for the hall. The doors were open. She slowed down to recover her breath, panting and dishevelled. A figure stepped forward. "Stop, Elizabeth!" It was Miss Ranger. She had been standing by the doors observing the meeting. She took hold of Elizabeth's arm and surveyed her. "There's no point in your going in now, Elizabeth. The meeting's just ended. Wherever have you been? You know you should wash your face and brush your hair before you come to a meeting. What have you been up to?" I was just out of doors, Miss Ranger," Elizabeth said lamely. She peered into the hall. She could hear benches being scraped back and the low buzz of conversation. William and Rita were leaving the platform. There were no monitors with them. What a short meeting! Miss Ranger was right. It had just ended. "Why isn't the whole school here?" she asked, puzzled. "Because something very unpleasant has happened which concerns only the first form. William and Rita are hoping it can be sorted out quickly. They would rather not have to bring it up at the big weekly meeting." Miss Ranger hurried off then, looking very upset. "Where did you get to, Elizabeth?" asked her classmates as they came out of the hall. One or two of them were looking at her with considerable curiosity. "Why didn't you want to come to the meeting?"
"Are you all right?"
"Of course I'm all right," replied Elizabeth impatiently. She pushed past them and found Julian, who was still in the hall. He was with Kathleen.
"We wondered what had happened to you, Elizabeth," he said calmly. "You've missed all the excitement."
"What excitement? What was the meeting about?" "Something terrible's happened," said Kathleen, her face pale. "Somebody's stolen one of the first form exam papers." Elizabeth was shocked. "How could somebody do that?"
"It seems they've been printed ready for next week and are in a drawer in the school office," explained Julian. "But the Beauty and the Beast counted them this evening and there's one missing. It's a copy of the paper we were all going to get for our English exam. Somebody got hold of their paper in advance."
"What a cheat!" said Elizabeth indignantly.
"Well, they haven't got away with it," shrugged Julian. "All the questions will have to be changed now. The joint heads must be furious. Shall we do a bit of detective work? That would be interesting."
"I can't, Julian," said Kathleen. "I'm right in the middle of tidying up my cubicle for dormy inspection. This meeting's been a real nuisance."
Elizabeth? Queried Julian. Elizabeth was also shaking her head. Of course, it was terrible that someone had stolen the English paper, and it must be someone in their class. Who could it be? Normally she would have been fascinated to do some detective work with Julian. They often solved things together. But this evening she had something else on her mind, something that was worrying her very much, a matter that she felt was of supreme importance. She had quite a different mystery to investigate. "I'm sorry," she said. "I want to go and talk to somebody about something. In fact, I'm off there right now." Kathleen looked puzzled as the naughtiest girl rushed away. "Don't forget, Elizabeth, we've got dormy inspection tonight. Don't go and disappear again," she called out. Julian just smiled and scratched his head. Dear Elizabeth, what was she up to now? It seemed to be something new. At least she didn't seem to have exams on the brain anymore. Elizabeth left the school building and hurried to the stables. She wanted to speak to the stableman. He was a real countryman and a fount of knowledge. She would ask him what a white cross on the trunk of a tree might mean. She would also ask him if he had ever put ropes round a tree, and if so, why. "We'll rope her up first thing in the morning." That's what the men had said. Of course, she mustn't let him suspect that she was asking about any particular tree. He might wonder how she knew so much about the oak tree when it didn't belong to Whiteleaf and was not even in the school grounds. She shouldn't really know anything about it at all.
But she had to speak to him urgently. It was her tree, and she had to know if anything was going to happen to it in the morning.
She desperately hoped not. Perhaps the stableman could give a simple explanation. Then she would hurry back and tidy up her cubicle for dormitory inspection. Silly old dormitory inspection. This was much more important.
"Where has Elizabeth got to now?" said Miss Ranger angrily. "Her behaviour is very strange at the moment."
The dormitory inspection was in full swing. Once a fortnight, the dormitories at Whiteleaf School were checked for tidiness. The class teacher concerned would accompany matron on a tour of inspection. All the other girls in number 6 stood to attention by their cubicles. Beds had been beautifully made, rugs straightened. The number of items on top of chests of drawers was limited to 6, as school rules ordained. So far, matron and Miss Ranger had been well pleased. But now they were staring into Elizabeth's empty cubicle in annoyance. It was a mess, and the naughtiest girl herself was nowhere to be seen. Where was she? She was climbing the stairs at that very moment, taking them slowly, one at a time. She was deep in thought and feeling trembly.
Mr. Tucker, the stableman, had not been at the stables. It had taken her some time to track him down.
But now, at last, she had the answer to her questions. "It's not fair. It's horrible," she raged to herself over and over again. "It's not in the least bit fair, and I shall make them stop." She was already forming a plan in her mind. She walked into dormitory 6, her face very tense and pale. In something of a daze, she noticed that Miss Ranger and matron were standing in her cubicle.
"Elizabeth, this is a disgrace," said matron. "Look at all the books on your chest of drawers." "And don't add your English book to the pile," scolded Miss Ranger, as she saw Elizabeth take the small volume out of her pocket. "Your school book should be in your desk, not up here."
"I've been reading it this evening for the exams," protested Elizabeth. She was still feeling in a daze.
"You should have been tidying up your cubicle," said Miss Ranger, standing by the bed. "What's your music case doing just dumped on top of the bed? And you haven't even bothered to put your music away."
The teacher gathered up the score and opened the brown leather case, intending to slip it neatly inside, but there was something in the way.
"Even your music case needs a tidy-up," she complained.
She pulled out a crumpled sheet of paper that had been stuffed just inside the case. She straightened it out and stared at it in disbelief.
"Elizabeth!"
The teacher's shocked cry brought everybody running to the scene. Miss Ranger was holding something aloft, between thumb and forefinger. She was waving it in front of the Naughtiest Girl.
Gasps of surprise echoed round Dormitory 6.
It was the stolen exam paper. "What was this English examination paper doing hidden in your case, Elizabeth?" asked Miss Granger.
Elizabeth gazed at the printed sheet in total astonishment. It was an exam paper, sure enough. Even from here she could see a list of questions about the English set book. She was speechless.
"Is that why you've been reading so avidly this evening?" continued the teacher in acid tones, glancing at the book in Elizabeth's hand. "To plan your answers to the exam question in advance?" "No," protested Elizabeth angrily. "Of course not, Miss Ranger." "I repeat, how did this exam paper come to be hidden in your music case?" asked the teacher. Matron was trying to usher the other girls out of earshot, but they were hanging on to every word. "Answer me, Elizabeth," rapped Miss Ranger. "I have no idea," exclaimed Elizabeth hotly. Calm, Elizabeth. Think carefully before you speak. You must have some idea of how a stolen exam paper could be found in your music case," said the teacher calmly. "Just think about it for a moment. It must have got there somehow, must it not?" Elizabeth's sense of outrage began to subside. Miss Ranger's comment was perfectly fair. How had it got in her case? She took a deep breath to try to calm herself. It had been such a shock. The little girl frowned deeply for a few moments as she tried to think clearly. Slowly the truth dawned on her. "Well, Elizabeth?" The Naughtiest Girl had become pink with excitement. I think I know the answer," she said. "You see, my music case has been in somebody else's possession all day." "Somebody else's possession?" Elizabeth's roommates glanced at each other uncomfortably. What a silly thing to say. The music case had been lying under her bed all day. They had noticed it there and wondered if she had forgotten about dormy inspection tonight. "Whose possession, Elizabeth?" I'd rather not say, Miss Ranger." It sounded very feeble. The teacher glanced at her watch. "It is nearly bedtime. You are to tidy up your cubicle this instant. Then if, as you say, there is somebody else involved in this matter, you are to bring them to the staff room before you go to bed. I will wait to see you there. If for any reason you cannot find this other person, there is nothing more we can do about it tonight. Miss Bell and Miss Best will see you in the morning." It was clear, realised Elizabeth, that Miss Ranger found it very difficult to believe her story. "Yes, Miss Ranger," she replied confidently. Very soon the teacher would see that her story was true. Chapter 9. Elizabeth Disappears. Arabella sat primly on her bed in pyjamas, pretending to read a book. The curtains of her cubicle were drawn. She knew that would hardly deter Elizabeth. She was expecting her at any moment.
Next door, in room 6, Matron had supervised Elizabeth while she tidied up her cubicle.
In those 10 minutes, the dramatic news had spread like wildfire. The boys alone, away to their own quarters by then, knew nothing of the unfolding drama. But the news had very quickly reached Arabella's dormitory.
The excited chatter had raged all around her.
"The paper was in Elizabeth's music case. She was caught red-handed. She tried to pretend someone else used her music case today. Miss Ranger says she'd better produce them." "I knew it was funny, the way she didn't come to the meeting. I said that was weird." "Poor Elizabeth. We knew she was in a bad way." "It was silly of her to waste all that time on the piano." "It's not a bit like Elizabeth to cheat. I'm so amazed." Arabella, already in pyjamas, had quickly drawn the curtain round her cubicle. She had peered inside her music case in horror. The truth had dawned. They must have got their cases muddled up yesterday. Elizabeth had come and swapped them back this evening without checking inside, and now everybody thought that she had stolen the exam paper. Suddenly, now the curtains parted.
So there you are, exclaimed Elizabeth, stepping into the cubicle. Just the person I want to speak to. Arabella's heart was thumping. She noted the fierce glitter in Elizabeth's eye. Am I? She asked innocently, looking up from her book. And why would that be, Elizabeth? You know perfectly well. It's about you stealing that exam paper and then putting it into my music case by mistake, hissed Elizabeth. We've got to go and see Miss Ranger straight away, the two of us. You had my music case all day, not your own. You will have to confess to her. I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about, exclaimed Arabella, deliberately raising her voice. How dare you accuse me of stealing something? I haven't touched your silly music case. It brought Rosemary onto the scene at once. Elizabeth's saying I haven't had my music case all day, Rosemary. She says I've been using hers. Did you ever hear such nonsense? Arabella's case has been here since yesterday evening. I've seen it, protested Rosemary. Look, there it is. It never budged. She pointed to its position on the floor, tucked between bed and chest of drawers. Whatever would she want yours for? Elizabeth stared at Arabella in disbelief. Arabella was refusing to own up. She must by now be perfectly well aware of what had happened, but she was not going to admit it. So you don't agree that you sneaked into the school office sometime today and took that exam paper? Asked Elizabeth scornfully. And then crept up here and hid it in the music case by your bed, thinking it was your own? If I hadn't come in here after tea and swapped it for your proper case, the exam paper would still be there now. Arabella had gone very white. Rosemary, thinking it was because of the outrageous things being said, turned on Elizabeth. You came and swapped it, did you? She jeered. Did anybody see you? Well, no. It's just that Elizabeth's voice trailed away. For the first time, she realised that she had not one single witness to support her story. It's just that you are sick with jealousy at Arabella's being chosen for the concert, said Rosemary, finishing Elizabeth's sentence in her own way. And not content with stealing the exam paper, you're now trying to pin the blame on her, so that you'll play in the concert instead of her. Arabella was breathing heavily. She was racked with emotion. Elizabeth had guessed the truth exactly, and faced with the fierce candour of what Elizabeth had been saying, Arabella had come within an ace of confessing, until Rosemary's words had reminded her of how much she stood to lose. The Leavers' concert, her great moment of triumph, was just 1 week away. So many times Elizabeth had had the last laugh, and she, Arabella, had been made to look stupid. All that would change now. People would look up to her. They would respect her. Perhaps they would even start to like her, the way they always liked Elizabeth. She had surprised herself how well she could play the piano. She had worked so hard for her moment of glory next week. Nothing was going to rob her of that. I really don't know anything about a silly exam paper, Elizabeth, she said, her face expressionless. You seem to have made a mistake. The Naughtiest Girl looked at her sorrowfully. You're a hopeless case, Arabella, she said quietly. There is no point in talking to you. She left and returned to her own dormitory. The room fell silent at her arrival, but she cared not. She went into her cubicle and drew the curtains. She lay down on top of the bed, still fully clothed. She turned on her back, head resting on hands, staring at the ceiling. Outside, dusk began to fall. None of her roommates came to see her or said good night. Her friends were too embarrassed. Poor Elizabeth, they were thinking. So worried about the exams, to creep into the school office like that, and caught red-handed, trying to pretend that it must have been somebody else. Miss Ranger, too, waiting in vain for Elizabeth to appear with somebody else, thinking exactly the same thing. They will have to think what they like, decided Elizabeth with a deep sigh. I can't prove my story is true, and I expect Arabella will never confess, never ever. But then life is not fair. No, nothing is fair. The amazing sequence of events since tea time had convinced her of that. She was not thinking of her own plight, but something of even greater concern. Soon she heard steady breathing from every corner of the dormitory. The others were all asleep at last. It was time to put her plan into action. When the rising bell sounded next morning, Elizabeth did not appear from her cubicle. Kathleen walked over and pulled back the curtain. "Wake up, Elizabeth, it's late." Then she gasped. The sun's morning rays slanted across Elizabeth's neat, empty bed. Kathleen could see at once that it had not been slept in. Elizabeth had disappeared. Chapter 10. A Hue and Cry. "Elizabeth's run away!" cried Kathleen in great alarm. "Look, she must have done. Her bed's not been slept in." The others rushed over. "I don't believe it!" exclaimed Jenny in astonishment. "Perhaps she's just got up early." "No, Kathleen's right." Belinda checked the bed carefully. "Look, the covers have never been pulled back. And you notice something? One of the pillows has gone." "Yes, and so's the spare blanket," realised Jenny. They all looked at one another in horror. Poor Elizabeth, overcome with shame, she had run away from Whiteleaf School. They had a sudden vision of her wandering the dark country lanes with blanket roll and pillow, sleeping in ditches, trying to make her way back home. "We should have been nicer to her," moaned Kathleen. "We should have been more understanding." As the word spread to the next dormitory, other pyjama-clad girls thronged in. They gathered round Elizabeth's empty bed, pale and shocked. Nobody looked more shaken than Arabella, who already had dark rings under her eyes from a bad night's sleep. The first form girls held an emergency meeting on the spot. "She'll never get home safely. It's more than 100 miles, and she hasn't any money," said Tessa. "I wonder where she slept last night." "Some smelly old barn, I expect." "What should we do?" asked Belinda. "Do you think we should go and report this to the Beauty and the Beast straight away?" "It's not like Elizabeth to run away when she's got a problem," decided Jenny, after giving it due thought. "Perhaps this is just one of her pranks, to give us all a fright. Perhaps she's hiding around the school somewhere. And if we go and tell the joint heads, she'll be in even deeper trouble," realised Kathleen. "More than she was already." "Yes, you're right," exclaimed Arabella eagerly. "We mustn't worry any of the teachers about this at the moment. That would be silly. Let's search the school buildings." "Perhaps she's asleep in one of the storerooms," suggested Rosemary. The first form girls rushed to get dressed. Then they fanned out in all directions, scouring the school buildings. Arabella scurried up and down the corridors, looking in the empty classrooms, opening and shutting each door with growing unease. Nobody had managed to find Elizabeth yet. Where was she? "I expect she'll turn up at breakfast time," said Rosemary to comfort her friend. "She hasn't any money, and she's bound to be starving hungry. It's not your fault, Arabella, if Elizabeth Allen has decided to do something idiotic." These were not the words to bring comfort to Arabella. Elizabeth did not turn up at breakfast. Sitting in the dining hall, staring at that empty place, Arabella's serious unease turned to panic. The naughtiest girl really had run away, and it was all her fault. She should have confessed about the exam paper while she still had the chance. Now Elizabeth felt hopeless about things and was sure that nobody would ever believe her. If only Rosemary had not butted in, thought Arabella, she might have admitted the truth. She'd been on the point of doing so. Now she was seized by a feeling of dread. Elizabeth could be in danger. Something dreadful might have happened. Supposing she'd been run over, and really, when she thought about it, Elizabeth was not that bad. She had her good points, after all. As she toyed with her breakfast cereal, Arabella's eyes kept straying to the door. How lovely it would be to see the naughtiest girl come strolling in through that open door, right now, laughing at them all and enjoying her silly joke. "Come back, Elizabeth," she kept thinking. "Oh, do please come back." But still Elizabeth did not appear, and by the end of breakfast there was a great hue and cry. Daniel went racing off to see if she might be sleeping in the school stables. "We must go and see the joint heads right away," said Joan, turning pale as soon as Kathleen had explained things to her. The second form monitor had looked across and noticed that her best friend's place at table was empty. "Oh, poor Elizabeth! I'm perfectly certain she would never have stolen an exam paper. She must be feeling very angry and upset at being misjudged."
"Hear, hear," agreed Julian.
Kathleen reluctantly rose to her feet. She was beginning to feel very guilty. "Will the heads ring the police, do you think, Joan?" "I'm sure they will," replied Joan. She looked across at Julian. "Do you want to come with us, Julian?" He just sat there, spooning down the last of his cereal. He shook his head. He was frowning.
"I might follow on in a minute," he muttered. "I'm just trying to have a good think."
There was a great buzz of excitement round the dining hall as Joan and Kathleen went off together. By now, nearly everybody knew what had happened. Elizabeth Allen's bed had not been slept in. It looked as though she must have run away from school. Now Joan and Kathleen were going to report it to Miss Bell and Miss Best. The joint heads would have to telephone the police. Julian put his spoon down, his brow deeply furrowed. The naughtiest girl was always full of surprises. Even so, he found this one most baffling. If she had taken that exam paper, she would have owned up at once, except that she would never have taken it in the first place. She had been unjustly accused, but in that case, the last thing she would do would be to run away.
Not the bold, bad Elizabeth. She would stay to fight her corner to the bitter end.
It was such a riddle. There must be some other reason for her vanishing trick, something different altogether. He was trying hard to remember a remark she had made 2 days ago. It was to do with her swotting for the exams, without wanting people to know how worried she was. "Got it," he whispered suddenly. "I remember what she said. I've got a secret place, you see." A secret place? Was that why they couldn't find her for the meeting yesterday? And was this now the explanation? Had the crazy Elizabeth been up all night, swatting for the exams in some secret hideout? "And still there," thought Julian, "probably fast asleep. But where is it?" At that moment Daniel returned. "She's not in the stables," he said miserably. "I think it was very catty of those girls last night, not accepting her word. Elizabeth would never cheat. No wonder she was upset. But it's all my fault," he confessed. "You see, I spilt the beans, Julian, about her being so worried about the exams. That's why they didn't believe her. I didn't mean to, but I did." "Oh, do shut up, Daniel," said Julian absently. "Can't you see I'm trying to think?" When Joan and Kathleen arrived at the school office, they were amazed to see Arabella had beaten them to it. "Come in, please," called the joint heads. They each sat behind a desk, and Miss Ranger stood by the window. She had arrived earlier to report back on the matter of the stolen exam paper. The culprit had been found. "Elizabeth Allen? Oh dear, how very disappointing," the joint heads had exclaimed. Arabella, accompanied by Rosemary, was already in there. They were both seated. Joan and Kathleen stared at them. Why had Arabella got there ahead of them? She seemed to be crying. Rosemary looked distressed too and was biting her lip. "Please ring the police, Miss Bell," Arabella was pleading tearfully. "I'm so worried about Elizabeth. I'm so frightened that something could have happened to her. And if it has, it's all my fault. I drove her to this. I drove her into running away.
I could have owned up about the exam paper when I had the chance, and I didn't." "You have owned up now, Arabella," said Miss Bell calmly. She nodded towards some more chairs. "Sit over there, please. Joan and Kathleen, you may join us." The two headmistresses were very composed. "We will have to contact the authorities, which will be very bad for Whiteleaf," Miss Bess began. "Before we do so, we need to be quite sure the child has run away. Have you all had a good look for her?"
"We've searched high and low, Miss Best," replied Kathleen, only just beginning to take it all in. Elizabeth had been telling the truth all along. Somehow her music case had been in somebody else's possession yesterday, Arabella's, and it was Arabella who had stolen the English exam paper. She'd come and confessed to Miss Ranger and the joint heads. As Miss Bell and Miss Bess asked further probing questions, Kathleen found it difficult to take her eyes off the fair-haired Arabella. It was strange to see her vain, doll-like face streaked with tears, to see her genuinely caring about somebody else, for the first time, somebody other than herself. "Please telephone the police," she implored again. The joint heads glanced at one another. It seemed that they had no choice.
"We'll speak to them right away," said Miss Best, reaching out for the telephone. "No," cried a boy's voice from the doorway. "Please don't ring them yet."
Julian walked eagerly into the room. Everybody stared at him.
"I might be able to find Elizabeth. I've got a hunch, but I'll need some time. Could you just give me 15 minutes, please? We can ring the police after that."
Miss Best took her hand away from the telephone. She glanced at Miss Bell and then nodded. They both knew that Elizabeth's friend was a brilliant boy.
"Very well, Julian. 15 minutes.
"And not a minute longer," added Miss Bell. Chapter 11. Well done, the naughtiest girl. "Don't worry, big brown moth. Don't worry, friendly little robin," whispered Elizabeth, as down below the men took the ropes off the back of the lorry. "Don't worry, chattering squirrels and cooing doves and busy little insects and creepy crawlies. This is your house. I won't let them chop it down, I promise." Hidden in the oak tree, Elizabeth had the fierce light of battle in her eye. She had slept fitfully in its warm boughs. It had been a much lighter sleep than usual, the sleep of a soldier at the battlefront, ready for the enemy and poised for action. And since dawn she had been wide awake. She knew that the woodmen might start work very early. That was why she had not dared to sleep in her proper bed last night. They had arrived at long last, not as early as she feared, but early enough. They parked their lorry on the wide grass verge below and began to sort through their equipment. She was ready for them. She tensed every muscle now. She was preparing to make her stand. At the same time, Julian was walking briskly round the grounds of Whiteleaf School. He was looking urgently about him. It was a chance remark of Daniel's that had given him his clue.
"Mr. Tucker, the stableman, hasn't seen Elizabeth since last night, Julian. She was asking him all about trees or something." So that was the person Elizabeth had rushed off to speak to last night, Mr. Tucker, to ask him about trees. Why trees? Trees. Secret place. Could Elizabeth's secret hideout be in a tree? And in that case, which one? What sort of tree? And then, in a flash of inspiration, Julian had remembered the piece of oak that Elizabeth had found him. That splendid piece of oak for his wood carvings. But where had it come from? She'd never explained. He had occasionally looked for oak himself and never found any. The reason being, as far as he could recall, that there were no oak trees in the school grounds. But there must be one somewhere, one that he had missed. And could that be where she had made her secret hideout? He walked round to the back of the stable block, looking up at all the trees there. Then he stared at the meadow beyond. There was not an oak tree in sight. He hurried back by way of the cricket pitch. He was almost giving up hope. Then suddenly he saw it.
It's been right under my nose, he realised. Only it's growing outside the school, on the other side of the wall. That's why I didn't notice it. He stood back and surveyed it. Elizabeth could have got into that tree by climbing up the boundary wall. And she has, gasped Julian as Elizabeth's head suddenly poked out of the middle of the tree. She was shouting. She seemed to be looking down at some people in the road. "Go away, please. Go away and take your horrid chainsaw with you. I'm staying here and I'm not going to budge. I won't let you cut this tree down. Never, ever. Don't you realise lots of little creatures live here? This is their home." Julian goggled for a moment and then came to a swift decision. He turned away and sprinted back towards the school buildings. At top speed. His 15 minutes was almost up. "Julian!" exclaimed Miss Ranger in relief as he burst back into the school office, his face shining. "You have some news?" "I've found her!" he exclaimed. "I know why she disappeared now. It had nothing to do with the exam paper or anything like that." He told them all that was happening. At first there were cries of joy and relief that Elizabeth had been found safe and well, but after that some anxious frowns appeared on the teachers' faces. "That beautiful old oak tree, the one that we can see from the school grounds, it's being taken down," said Miss Bell. "Oh, Miss Best, we must do something about it, and quickly." "We certainly must," agreed Miss Best. "I will ring the tree department as soon as the council office is open." She rose to her feet and rapped out an order. "Julian, you are to return to the tree immediately. You are to join Elizabeth there. She needs reinforcements. Under no circumstances are either of you to come down from that tree until we give you permission. And please tell Elizabeth that refreshments are on their way." "Oh, Julian, I'm so glad you turned up when you did," said Elizabeth. "I was getting so tired of arguing with those men. I don't think I could have stuck it out much longer up here. Not on my own. Not without any breakfast." "Another hour should do it," grinned Julian. Seated comfortably in the tree, the two friends munched the last of the delicious sandwiches that Joan and Arabella had brought out to them. They offered the robins a few crumbs. It was morning break, and quite a crowd of boys and girls was starting to gather below. The woodmen had long since retreated. They had parked their lorry some distance away down the road. They were sitting in the cab, drinking tea from a flask, waiting helplessly for further instructions. "They tried to tell me the tree needed to come down for a road-widening scheme," said Elizabeth indignantly. "A beautiful, healthy tree like this, with no disease at all. Who wants the silly road widened? Drivers can go a bit slower as they always have done and still have a lovely old tree to look at." The tree department people agreed with Elizabeth entirely. It turned out that the powers that be hadn't got all the correct paperwork, so the men weren't allowed to cut the tree down. Within the next hour, an official arrived and pinned a notice to the old oak. It was an emergency tree preservation order. It would go to appeal, of course, but now Miss Bell and Miss Best were involved, Elizabeth was confident the tree would survive. The doves cooed and all the little birds sang, as though in gratitude.
Elizabeth's heart sang loudest of all, as, aching with tiredness, she and Julian were given permission to descend from the tree at long last. Everybody cheered.
"Well done, Elizabeth! Well done, the naughtiest girl!" Chapter 12. Goodbye to William and Rita. Nevertheless, Elizabeth had been in breach of school rules. The big oak tree was out of bounds. She had visited it not once but several times, and she had spent an entire night away from her dormitory, causing everyone great alarm and anxiety. That was a most serious offence. At the big school meeting the next day, it all had to be written down in the book. It was the last meeting of the summer term, and the last one ever for William and Rita. There were serious matters to discuss, and the head boy and girl were determined that they should be dealt with fairly and wisely. All their conclusions would be written in the book,
offering help and guidance to future meetings after they'd gone.
As soon as you expected the tree was in danger, Elizabeth, you should have reported it to a monitor, said William, even though to do so would have meant confessing that you'd been out of bounds. Another time, you must try not to take matters into your own hands.
Yes, William, agreed Elizabeth contritely. I'm sorry. On the other hand, said Rita, busily writing in the book, this was one of those very rare occasions when breaking a school rule had a beneficial outcome. If you had not been exploring the tree in the first place, you would never have discovered that it was to be felled. It would have been lost. Although you should not have acted alone, your action was brave, and so that must go in the book too. The meeting had to deal with Arabella's crimes too. That was more difficult. At the behest of the joint heads, Miss Ranger had started giving Arabella some extra lessons in preparation for Monday's English exam. She would have to spend the entire weekend on difficult exercises. There would be a completely new paper set, of course. The Beauty and the Beast had reasoned correctly that the girl must be beside herself with panic to have stooped so low. She clearly needed help. At the same time, cheating was a serious offence at Whiteleaf School, and so was letting someone else take the blame. These were things that the meeting must deal with. There was also the very difficult matter of next week's Leavers concert to think about. Should Arabella still be allowed to play, or should Elizabeth take her place? "Why did you practice so hard for the concert, Arabella?" asked Rita, as the fair-haired girl stood up, "when you should have been working for your summer exams?" "At first, I just wanted to be chosen to spite Elizabeth," replied Arabella truthfully. "She always seems to be better at things than me, and then she laughs at me. I don't know why nobody likes me and everybody likes Elizabeth." "Elizabeth can be very naughty, but she has a warm heart, and that is why people like her," explained Rita. "She cares for others, whereas you are sometimes thought not to." "It wasn't a bit warm-hearted of her to make such a contest of it," complained Arabella. "She knew I was better than her, but she started practising so hard I didn't dare slack off after that. I was so worried about the exams, but I couldn't let Elizabeth beat me, and I knew she wanted to. It was my big chance to shine, you see," she blurted out. "I did so want to be chosen. That was the only reason I took so long to confess about the exam paper."
"Is this true, Elizabeth?" asked William.
The whole school was listening in fascination.
"That you knew Arabella was better than you, but decided to make a battle of it, even when you both had exams coming up?"
For the first time, Elizabeth felt a twinge of shame. "Yes, it is true," she said, hanging her head. "I did realise Arabella was better quite early on, but I still wanted to beat her, even though I'd been in the school play and she hadn't, and even though it meant skimping all my revision, and so in a way I suppose I stopped her revising as well." Sitting down again next to Julian on the first form benches, Elizabeth began to think deeply about things. Poor Arabella. Elizabeth had been working hard and was starting to lose her fear of the exams. But she could tell that Arabella was as worried as ever. It must be dreadful to be the oldest in the form and always struggling near the bottom. On the platform with the other monitors, Joan put her hand up. "Please, William, don't just blame Elizabeth. I think it was wrong of me, but I heartily encouraged her at the time." "And I encouraged Arabella," exclaimed Rosemary, jumping to her feet. "I tried to mention the exams sometimes, but most of the time I just egged her on." The head boy looked from Joan to Rosemary and nodded.
"Thank you both for speaking up," he said. "There's an important lesson to be learnt here. The rest of the school, please take note. We always want to please our friends, don't we? We like to say to them the things that they want to hear. But sometimes the thing that is best for them is the very last thing that they want to hear. The finest friendship you can give someone is to stand up to them sometimes and tell them when you think they are doing the wrong thing." Joan at once nodded agreement.
Rosemary sat down, feeling very ashamed at the way she had always pretended to agree with Arabella, even when she knew she was wrong. Elizabeth glanced at Julian admiringly. He had told her several times that she was overdoing things with the piano business. Rita wrote all this down. Then she, in turn, addressed the school. "There is something else I would like to point out, to both Elizabeth and Arabella. But it applies to the rest of us too. It is very easy to care about people whom we like. To care equally for those people whom we don't like is much more difficult, but is something we must strive for." Shyly, Kathleen put her hand up. "Please, Rita, Arabella was really upset when she thought something had happened to Elizabeth, even though she doesn't like her. She was crying." The Naughtiest Girl's eyes opened wide at this surprising piece of news. She turned to look at Arabella, but the other girl turned her head away, embarrassed. "Thank you for pointing that out, Kathleen," said Rita. "And this brings us to the final business of the meeting. We have given everything a good airing, and now we have to decide about the Leavers concert. Should Arabella still be allowed to represent the first form, or should Elizabeth take her place?" "This is going to be a very difficult decision," added William. "Rita and I will talk it over with the monitors." Everybody on the platform went into a huddle. There seemed to be a long argument going on. Elizabeth sat very tense and still. So did Arabella. All around them the hall buzzed with conversation as the boys and girls discussed among themselves which of the two girls should be allowed to play. Then William banged the gavel on the table for silence. "We are finding it impossible to reach agreement," he announced. He gazed towards the back of the hall, where, as always, Miss Bell, Miss Best and Mr. Johns sat in on the meeting. They never joined in unless their advice was sought. "We would like the heads to tell us what they think." Miss Bell at once rose to her feet. She was smiling. "While you have been discussing this difficult problem, we have been discussing it too. We have decided that you should let Elizabeth and Arabella use their own good sense in the matter. Let them discuss it together privately. Let them decide which of them should play at the Leavers concert." It was the end of summer term at Whiteleaf, the very last day of the school year. William and Rita and the others were leaving today. Exams were over and the results posted on the board. Elizabeth had passed. She would be going up into the second form next term. She would be reunited with Joan. She would be going up with Julian and Patrick and Kathleen and Belinda and Jenny and Arabella. Somehow Arabella had managed to scrape through the English exam and had passed in maths and French as well. She had failed some other papers, but because of her tremendous progress in music this term, had been given some useful bonus marks for that instead. So she was being allowed into the second form. "As a matter of fact, I really like my piano practice now," she had confided to the music master. "I never realised how satisfactory it could be to find out that there's something one is really good at." Mr. Lewis was delighted. It was time for the Leavers concert. He was up on the platform in the hall now, smiling at Sophie as she waited nervously with her flute. She would be the first to perform. All the parents had arrived and the hall was crammed full. The girl from the junior class soon got over her nerves. She gave a faultless performance. Everybody applauded. William and Rita, sitting in the front row, sat very still. They glanced at each other, moist-eyed, for they knew that this concert would be their last memory of Whiteleaf. "And now," announced Mr. Lewis, "to represent the first form, we have one of our most gifted pupils, Arabella Buckley." Sitting between her parents, near the front, Elizabeth watched Arabella as she walked onto the platform. She put her music in place on the grand piano, which had been brought into the hall for this special occasion. How magnificent it looked! Arabella looked quite small against it. She looked different today, thought Elizabeth. Her fair hair brushed and gleaming, a spot of colour in each cheek, her eyes sparkling. As she started to play, A deep hush descended over the audience. The pictures came again to Elizabeth, conjured up by the music. Those lovely visions of green fields, grass blowing, clouds scudding across blue sky, wooded hills. What a fine player Arabella was. William and Rita listened, enraptured. All too soon it was over. Children from other classes came and went. Richard played his fine new piece. Then Courtney Wood, the well-known concert pianist, performed for the rest of the programme as planned. It had been a wonderful Leavers concert this year, and yet, for Elizabeth, it was Arabella's music that lingered in the mind. Had the head boy and girl enjoyed it as much as she had? She did hope so. Afterwards, she and Julian went to say goodbye to them. They were deeply touched when Julian presented them with the little wood carvings. "They are quite beautiful, Julian," exclaimed Rita.
"Father Bear rather looks like me, doesn't he?" laughed William in delight.
He turned to face Elizabeth and smiled approvingly.
"So you and Arabella sorted it out then? How did you decide?"
"It was easy," replied Elizabeth. "I just thought Arabella's piece would be the best memento for you. Better than mine, actually. I'm just sorry that I haven't got anything of my own to give you." "But we heard your music drifting out one evening, Elizabeth, and that was lovely too," said Rita quietly. "I will never be able to hear Greensleeves in future without its reminding me of you." Elizabeth blushed with pleasure.
"Naughtiest girl in the school, best girl in the school," laughed William. "You have no need to give us a memento." He bent and kissed her on the cheek. Then Rita did likewise.
"Memento, please don't be silly."
"Dear Elizabeth, how could we ever forget you?"